Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Skype sessions. Now, this season we read through the Four Loves, and it's wonderful, but it also has some things that really irritate me. Principally, that Lewis never actually defines what love is. And when we come to that final love, agape, charity, it does seem a bit ambiguous. It's like, what actually is this? Is this supernatural grace? Is this the same sort of love as the natural loves, but that just go far further, that aren't prompted by biology, and that would even elicit the greatest sacrifices possible? Basically, I had lots of questions. And I'm Catholic, so St. Thomas Aquinas is a big deal. And he was a great systematizer. He stood on the shoulders of people like Aristotle and Augustine, both two authors that Lewis knew very well. And so I wanted to know what St. Thomas thought. So I cracked open the Summa, and about 5 seconds afterwards, I closed it again because it's really difficult and hard to understand, and I'm not that trained in it. So I thought I would find somebody who is. And so I'd like to welcome to the show Father Aquinas. Father Aquinas, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I am really excited about this because I have questions. I have lots of questions. So,
sure. I hope I have some answers. Aquinas has the answers. Maybe Father Aquinas can explain a few of them.
That'll do. I'll be happy with that. But before we get to the meat and potatoes of this, would you mind just introducing yourself to our viewers?
Sure. My name is Father Aquinas Gilba. I'm a Dominican priest of the province of St. Joseph. That's in the eastern part of the United States. I'm in Washington, D.C. I live at the Dominican House of Studies, which is our studium or our seminary for this province. I've taught on the faculty here for the last 7 years, teaching moral theology, including the class on the theological virtues, which probably will come in handy today. But beginning this past summer, I am now currently the university chaplain across the street at the Catholic University of America. So Dominicans were just invited to take on that new ministry this summer. So I and three other friars from this house are the new chaplains there. And we are just finishing the first week of class. And my life has turned upside down, but it's been great. Yeah.
I always thought it was very bold, the university to call themselves the Catholic University of America.
The Catholic University.
We kind of did the same thing with the podcast. We said the C.S. Lewis podcast as our little tagline. And then then another podcast started called the C.S. Lewis podcast. So it's a battle for egos at the moment.
Well, here the university does have some claim to it because this is the only Catholic university in the States founded by the bishops. So this is the bishops' university. So it's the official Catholic University of America.
I love it.
Papally sanctioned. Leo XIII gave the papal charter for the university back in the late 19th century. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, they first came on my radar through their patristic scholarship. I often see them their stuff stamped on any of the manuscripts that I was reading.
Yeah, CUA Press here is excellent for many things, but one of them is the long tradition of publishing translations of patristic works.
Well, I mentioned St. Thomas earlier, and he is reasonably well known to most Catholics, I would say. Certainly when I started really digging into my faith, you can't go too long without bumping up into him. But we have lots of non-Catholic Christians who listen to our podcast and watch our channel. So would you mind just giving us a 2-minute summary of who St. Thomas is and what he wrote before we start digging into what he thought?
Sure. So St. Thomas Aquinas is a leading intellectual light for the Catholic Church. The Church has long regarded him as the teacher among many teachers. There are many doctors of the Church, but St. Thomas is called the common doctor because because of the generality of his teaching, the scope of his vision, but also his applicability to nearly every aspect of Christian and human life. Just the Summa Theologiae, which is his principal work, which he composed towards the end of his life, which he wrote for beginners, as you might know.
It's embarrassing. It really is.
It is. But from A to Z, from first question to last, really the whole of the scope of reality, can be found in there. There's not one aspect of created existence really that isn't touched in some way by the Summa. So just it's impressive, just the the breadth of his wisdom and knowledge. He does come, I would say, he comes at the end of the patristic age. He's in the Middle Ages, certainly, but I think he closes the patristic age in a very interesting way. St. Augustine would be the great light, Gregory the Great, whose feast we celebrate today. These are two, tremendous figures in the patristic age. But St. Thomas comes at the end of that and systematizes kind of the whole of 1,000 years of Christian reflection with the assistance of Aristotle. It has to be said that St. Thomas couldn't do what he did without the assistance of Aristotle. Aristotle had been rediscovered just in the century before St. Thomas. And it's not specifically because of what Aristotle concluded about many questions. It was really more his approach and his method that allowed St. Thomas and the other scholastics to approach the great treasure of patristic wisdom and knowledge and systematize it in such a way that question by question, piece by piece, we could go through with reason, with understanding, and put together in St. Thomas's understanding a science of the faith. Science in the sense of not what we understand today as like the scientific method, but a science according to a body of knowledge. That Aquinas was convinced that what God has revealed to us about himself, what God has revealed to us about us and the church. The whole of the Paschal mystery, the whole of the life of the church is put before us as something intelligible, something to be explored and understood, and then something that can be articulated, in terms of teaching others. And that's why St. Thomas is so keen on this notion of sacra doctrina, sacred doctrine, sacred teaching, a science of the faith that, question by question, piece by piece, article by article, he lays out systematically in the Summa. That work has then been kind of a touchstone for Catholic theological reflection since the 13th century, and continues to be even today.
Well, let's draw on a little bit of that clarity. As I mentioned, Lewis in the Four Loves, he gives no real solid definition for love. You can sort of squirrel one out of the radio talks, but throughout the season, the definition I kept offering was the one that I had received from Bishop Barron when he speaks about St. Thomas, and he says that love is the seeking of the good of the other as other. And so just to kick things off, what does that mean? And does St. Thomas make any distinctions in the same way that Lewis does between affection, friendship, eros, charity? Does he have his own framework for understanding love?
Well, he does. And so it is, he's got his own anthropology, which is to say, for Aquinas, he approaches questions of action, and love is going to be one of these actions in terms of powers, acts, and their ends. So when we think of something like eros or think of something like agape, the first thing Aquinas is going to want to ask is, okay, well, what power of the soul does this, movement originate? What is its proper act? And also then what is its proper end? So Aquinas doesn't start with, as Lewis does, kind of outlining this kind of systematization of four loves. Just a Thomist would look at that list right away and say, well, actually, you don't have four loves there as we might understand them. You've already articulated it, that some are affections, some are passions, others are more kind of the effect of election, choice, which is not the same as passion or affection. So when Aquinas sets out in the Summa to go ahead. Oh, sorry.
I was just wanted to offer a question of clarity. So when you speak about passion, you're not talking about like romantic passion. You're talking more about our emotional impulses. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So for Aquinas, when he looks at the human person, he says that, okay, first of all, every creature desires its own good because it desires its own perfection. So he sees that every created thing somehow has desire, somehow has love. Why? Because it requires the enjoyment of some good to actualize the potencies of its nature. So birds need to build nests in order to reproduce. Human beings need truth in order to enter into friendship. Grass needs water, to grow. So all of these things. So you can say that birds desire nests in a certain way. Humans desire truth. Grass desires water because they all need these things to grow into being what they are. And that takes place or exists in a very particular way in the human person, where we have really three powers by which we not only discern, but also choose and then move towards those goods that perfect us. We have intelligence, we have will, free choice, and then also passion or emotion, like the gut, you know. Uh, so we have intelligence, but also two types of appetite: rational appetite, which is, the will, which, functions according to choice, but also what we would Aquinas call sense appetites. And these move simply according to our sense perceptions. We see a chocolate chip cookie, we get hungry. We see a tall beer, we get thirsty. These things aren't, rocket science, and they just happen in us instinctively, as
I have
part of
a
our animal nature,
I have a 1-year-old, and he just
right?
immediately knew that cookies are delicious. He'd never tasted one before. He just
Exactly.
saw it, and suddenly like, "Da."
Yeah, yeah. So when Aquinas talks about passion, he's talking about those sense appetites, those kind of instinctive movements of our gut. When we come into contact with pleasurable things. Um, So already, we see a way in which Aquinas is going to distinguish, let's say, between agape and eros, because they have two different seats in us. Eros, being kind of the erotic passion, the erotic emotion. At least that's a principal kind of manifestation of it. Whereas agape is going to come from, and as well as friendship, from more of a higher kind of elective love, the love that follows upon real choice, and command on our part. So when Aquinas sets out to begin to look at charity, because he's a theologian, and if you look at the whole of the Summa, what Aquinas is trying to do is just make the scriptures intelligible to us. That's really his whole project. And so he's confronted with this question of charity, which we read. You can't read a page of the New Testament, and you can't read a paragraph of St. Paul without coming across this mystery, this reality of charity. And so Aquinas sets out in the Summa to make intelligible what Christian charity is. And whenever Aquinas is trying to unpack or unfold some kind of Christian mystery, he always begins with what is more familiar to us to help us to understand what is less familiar to us. So, if in fact there is a theological virtue that's infused in us by grace at baptism, which is an act of loving, he first looks at, well, what is natural love first? That which we're more familiar with, we can describe, we get a real grasp on. And how does that then help us to understand what the theological virtue of love, the theological virtue of charity is? And so that's where Aquinas begins. And first, in order to explain what charity is, Aquinas begins with friendship. And it's what you said at the beginning, Bishop Barron's definition of love. That's basically a definition of what Aquinas would call benevolent love, the love of friendship. It's basically the love of the good for the sake of the other, out of which then comes real love for the other for the sake of the other. So in order to make that distinction, to help us to understand friendship, Aquinas says, well, first of all, we have two ways of loving. There's the love of concupiscence and the love of benevolence. The love of concupiscence is not the vice of concupiscence, which we might think of when we hear that word, but simply the love of some good for myself,
Mhm.
which is a very natural and good way of loving. Like, I love the hamburger for myself. I love my home. Why? For myself. I love any number of things that are good for me simply because they are good for me. And that's not a vicious kind of loving. That's a very good and natural way of loving. It's not the only way we love, though. We don't love goods only because of the good effect they have for me. I can actually love goods too for the good that they have for another. And that's what Aquinas calls then the love of benevolence. We actually transfer from ourselves to another the good regard that we have, or the love that we have for some good. I don't have to love it just for myself. I can actually love it for another. That's a
Mm.
higher kind of love. That's the love of friendship. So Aquinas recognizing then that we have these two kinds of loves, two kinds of elective love. The love of concupiscence, the love of benevolence. Aquinas asks, well, when we look at charity, when we ask, well, what kind of love is this? Uh, he says, well, we see that it's the perfection, it's the elevation and perfection of the love of benevolence. It's the love of friendship. God allows us to love His good and then himself, for God's own sake. And that requires grace, that requires elevation. We can't do that on our own. Only God introduces us and invites us into that mystery. Only God can give us his own happiness as something that we can love for his sake. But once he does, well, then we can live the life of charity, which is to say we can love God for God's sake, our neighbor for God's sake, and then everything that God loves for his own sake. And that's that's how all of our love of concupiscence and all of our love of benevolence is taken up then and perfected into the love of charity. So that's where Aquinas begins. And that's already, that's some high mystical, content there in terms of, you can spend years just contemplating, that reality. But that's what Aquinas just lays out as just a simple fundamental understanding of the theological virtue of charity. When God infuses charity into us, he elevates the love of benevolence in us so that it's not just other human creatures we can love as we love ourselves, but we can love God. We can extend that love of friendship to God himself and to love him in all things for his own sake.
Now, this is very encouraging because this
Right.
has sort of been my working theory as to how I can stitch what Lewis says into a coherent whole, because we have spoken about it, and you could very easily see some contradictions, and also some contradictions when you try and mesh what he says with Catholic theology. So, for example, you just mentioned that charity is a theological virtue, and in catechism class, that is drilled into you that this is a gift from God. But then that begs a whole load of questions. And the fundamental one is, if we're going to say that it is just this, and I think you've already given us our way out and our way of seeing how we get from A to B. But if we say that charity is purely God's gift to us, that it is his grace, his supernatural life in us that we receive in baptism, that creates a problem when we see non-Christians loving in the most extreme sense possible, such as a mother giving her life for her child, such as Jesus said, man has no greater love than to lay down his life for his friends. Well, we see non-Christians doing that as well. We can see even in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the guy isn't a Christian, he's not even a Jew, but here he is going out of his way to help somebody who isn't himself. He is seeking the good of the other as other in a way that is awe-inspiring. So then that then begs the question, well, do we have this theological virtue of charity, and do we have a natural one that corresponds with it? And I sort of see the way that you're talking about this beneficent love and God bringing that perfection as our way of explaining what we see. Because when I first started reading the Summa, St. Thomas says some very seemingly harsh things about what, that only Christians can ever truly love. And it's like, well, what do we make of non-Christians? Do we go with something, say, like St. Justin Martyr, when he's speaking about the pre-Christians and looking at people like Socrates and referring to them as basically Christians because they were using the light that they had and they were unknowingly participating in the life of God that way. So I've thrown a lot of stuff at the wall. Would you mind unpacking that and seeing how much of that you think you can square with Thomas?
Yeah, no, the more you get to know St. Thomas and to read him in context of other writers and other teachers in his time, St. Albert the Great, St. Bonaventure, and others, you really do see how unique Aquinas was. I mean, he stood alone almost, especially on this question, because the conventional wisdom that he inherited and kind of what was in the air around him, and there was a 1,000-year tradition of this too, dating back to Augustine, is that it's to look at love is to say that man by nature, he can only love in a selfish kind of way, and this is only irritated and even aggravated by the fall. And so then, in order to love as the New Testament describes love, man needs inserted into himself or infused into himself a new kind of loving, so that the love of nature and the love of grace are in fact by species, like two very different kinds of love.
And that's how a lot of people read the four loves: natural, 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 something very, very different.
Right.
But when you read carefully what he says, it doesn't seem to quite actually be as neat as the framework initially suggests.
Right. So Aquinas has an allergy to this view. Why? Because he's convinced that grace elevates and perfects nature. grace doesn't come to destroy nature or to insert into nature something that had kind of no antecedent or no precedent. So for him, when you look at love, if he's going to understand charity well, according to that principle, then you need to find that natural principle of charity, which for him, again, is the love of friendship, you know. So what the theological virtue does when it's infused into us, it elevates and perfects the natural love of beneficence, the natural love of friendship, such that God, too, in himself can become an object of friendship, that he invites us into a relationship of friendship, you know, with him. And so it's not going to be a surprise then for St. Thomas to look out and see, well, we can find all kinds of examples of natural friendship and even kind of the heights of a kind of sacrificial friendship, love for the common good, self-sacrifice for the common good, out of a kind of love for neighbor and the well-being of the neighbor, even among non-Christians, the non-baptized. Why? Because this is just that is in a sense a very natural form of loving. St. Albert the Great struggled with this, you know, and it's reading Aristotle, his Ethics, that helped him to see that the Augustinian position wasn't right on all counts, especially for the reasons you named. I mean, we can look at fathers and mothers sacrificing themselves for the well-being of their children. We can see soldiers laying down their lives for the preservation of the city. There was a way in which Christians would see that and try to identify, well, they're not really doing that for real love or the real good. Somehow that's all tainted by pride and is somehow sinful. And unless they have charity, you know, they can't be doing anything good in those moments. And Albert and others, St. Thomas especially, said, no, that can't be right. Yes, it's not charity. So they're not meriting heaven in that sense, in the way we can in charity, but they're still accomplishing something good. It may be imperfect, but we still have to say it's good, and as a source of a kind of joy and happiness, even if it's not supernatural beatitude. There is still something about natural happiness, the natural good, and natural beatitude that even non-Christians can attain to a certain extent. The fall hurts that. The fall, you know, hinders us from achieving that. So it's an imperfect enjoyment of imperfect happiness, imperfect enjoyment of an imperfect good, but still good and not sinful because of its imperfection. That's Aquinas's position, I think, and so helps us to make sense of where we can applaud the good that, let's say, the pagan world can achieve without conflating it with or confusing it with the meritorious good of beatitude or of glory that's offered us by grace, you know, by Christ.
I think this jives very nicely with Lewis, because there are a few phrases that he says in the final chapter on charity that this reminds me of. He talks about that we don't have to throw out our silver to make room for the gold. Now, if that isn't grace building on nature, I don't know what is. And he also has a constant refrain throughout where he's quoting St. Francis de Sales, where he says the highest doesn't stand without the lowest. Again, this sounds very much grace is building on nature. That we can be trying to love in the way that he loves us, capital H, capital L, and we can do that to some or lesser extent based on our own virtue. But the point is that when we are truly loving in, say, the way that the saints do it, the way that all of the great heroes of the faith loved, that is natural love, but that is being infused and supported and powered by supernatural love, to allow people to truly give of themselves, to be praying for their persecutors as they are going to death.
Yeah, I would say this. The only qualification or maybe clarification to give to what you just said, I think that's all right. It's just that we do have to recognize that charity does introduce a new object of our loving, which is to say God in himself. You know, to love God as he is in himself is not possible without baptism, without the theological virtue of charity. We can love, without baptism, without revelation, we can know that God is. We can know some things about him, But he still remains a kind of anonymous first cause and final end, and we can think about him naturally and a kind of love him naturally in that way. Aquinas would probably allow that there's a kind of natural religion that might flow from that natural love of God. But the fact that God has revealed himself to us, that we see his face on the face of Christ, that we hear his voice in the word of Christ, and that we can enter into real knowledge and love of him, as his word is made flesh. It's God in himself now,
Mm-hmm.
in the eternal realms, as he's made himself available to us by knowledge and by love, that he can become a real object of our knowing and loving.
Because we love what we know.
That's right. He's made us to know him, not anonymously as first cause and final end, but as he is in himself, as a trinity of persons, and as Aquinas says, the effect can't, because the effect can't be greater than the cause. Like our love for God can't surpass our knowledge of him. It's God who makes charity possible by revealing himself to us, and by then giving us the grace, giving the creature the grace to enter into real knowledge and participation of knowledge and a participation of love in him, which is the Christian life, which is charity, which is very distinct from the heroic love of the city or the heroic love of the family that's achievable by the unbaptized or the pagan.
It makes me think of in the Epistle to the Romans when St. Paul is describing when we've come to know God, because the Holy Spirit love has been poured into our hearts. That is what he seems to see as the major difference of the before and the after. And all this also very nicely ties in with a subject we keep coming back to on the podcast, and that's theosis, because Lewis, he doesn't use the word, but he spends a lot of his time talking about this idea, and it's rooted in the idea of participation. And so we can only participate with God when he reaches out to us. And once we are in participation with him, we can know him and therefore be transformed by him in a way that we couldn't otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, Aquinas, when you start scratching below the surface on this, so you can find these things on charity in the Summa, but when then you look at other of his writings, commentaries on scripture, but also some of his quodlibetal questions and his treatment of the individual virtues, I mean, he has a real profound understanding of what does it take to enter into friendship with somebody, and he says it's not just a common nature, it's not just common affection, but that there's some good that's good for both, that they share, that unites them even before they have any kind of even psychological awareness of each other or any kind of communication. So, for example, members of a family are joined to each other because they belong to that same family, even before they might share words and affection with each other. And even if they never did share affection and words with each other, they're still members of the same family, Aquinas sees something to happen in charity, in our friendship with God. God, out of sheer mercy and love for us, offers us as a common end, as something we share with him, his happiness. God offers us his own joy, his own happiness, his own beatitude as the final end of our lives. And because we share that, we enter in a kind of society with God, within which then words, communication, affection can be shared. And that's again, this is kind of high mystical contemplation of a real mystery, that Aquinas recognizes that in charity, God enters into a kind of society with human creatures, with man, by establishing his own happiness as a common object of love and as a common end, which then we can respond to that, in what we call charity, which for Aquinas is man's response in love to the invitation by God to beatitude. So, again, that's why friendship for Aquinas is the key lens through which to perceive how it is that we should understand charity, but also just to understand what it is that St. Paul is talking about in the New Testament.
Mm. And it's also nicely illustrated in the story about St. Thomas, where towards the end of his life, as he's wrapping up the Summa, he's in the chapel, he offers it to God, and And the Lord says to
Right.
him, "You have written well of me. What would you like?"
Right.
And he says, "Nothing but you,
Right.
Lord." That
Right.
all of this
And
stuff
that's it. Yeah.
was a signpost pointing further up and further in,
Right.
as we might say.
Exactly. And St. Thomas, reflects that, that the more intelligent one is, the greater his own natural intelligence, the onus is on him to believe more than others, and and to be more ardent in his charity because of his greater faith, and certainly I think St. Thomas, recognized that in himself. So, yeah.
To paraphrase another great philosopher, with great power comes great responsibility.
That's right, exactly.
Well,
And
Father,
certainly with the power of faith or the power of the theological virtues. Yeah, that's certainly true.
Father Aquinas, this has been wonderful. Thank you for clearing up a lot of things for me and letting me know I'm still within the
Thank you.
bounds of orthodoxy.
You are.
Thank you. Just as we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like people to know, either about Aquinas himself or anything that you and the brothers are doing at the moment?
Sure. Well, I would encourage anyone to check out the Thomistic Institute website, such as thomisticinstitute.org. That's an institute that's run out of the House of Studies here, and there's all kinds of online content, just in terms of a series we have, Aquinas 101. So this is a slow walk through the Summa in bite-sized videos, but also then specialized series focusing on certain particular topics, especially the moral life. They're producing a series on the sacraments, presently. But at the Thomistic Institute website, you can find not only all of these video series, but every program that they host is recorded and podcasted. And so, if St. Thomas interests you or anything, about St. Thomas or the Catholic intellectual tradition, that's just a treasure trove there of online content at the Thomistic Institute.
Wonderful. I would also just add to that for any non-Catholics watching, he's an amazing scripture scholar. This was actually my real entry into St. Thomas
That's
when I
right.
started looking at his commentaries, as well as the
Yeah.
Catena Aurea, which the Pope commissioned him to scour the
Mhm.
church fathers and basically apply their commentary to the Gospels. So you have the four Gospels, and then underneath it, you can read about what St. Gregory the Great, what St. John Chrysostom, what St. Augustine, what they wrote about in reference to these particular verses. So
Mhm.
there's gold in them there hills.
There is.
Well, Father, thank you again for coming on.
Thank you. A pleasure. God bless.
And everyone, please join us again next time, and we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.